Mr. President, honorable members of the court, it's a great honor and a privilege to appear before you today as the representative of the state of Qatar in these important proceedings. Mr. President, the court's advisory opinion of 19 July 2024 confirmed that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful and must be brought to an end as rapidly as possible. Unfortunately, Israel did not end its occupation. It has continued its genocidal war against the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, which is not only an international crime, but the crime of crimes which shocks the conscience of mankind. It's a blatant disregard of the court's advisory opinion, and in a blatant disregard of the court's advisory opinion, Israel increased settlement and annexation in the West Bank through force. According to the UN, approximately 1,000 Palestinians have been killed there since October 2023, and over 40,000 have been forcibly displaced by settler violence and Israel's military campaign in the West Bank. As the UN Special Rapporteur and the OBT stated in a press release that you can find at tab 1 of your folders, we're witnessing new trails of tears in the West Bank, mirroring Gaza's fate. In Gaza, Palestinians also continue to face famine-like conditions as Israel has completely blocked any delivery of life-saving aid of millions of Palestinians. In a joint statement on April 7th, top UN officials stated that more than 2.1 million people are trapped, bombed, and starved again in Gaza, and that Israel's acts of war show an utter disregard for human life. You can find this statement at tab 2 of your folders. At the same time, Israel has jeopardized the very existence of UNRWA, the backbone of humanitarian and development assistance across the OBT. This renders these proceedings of a paramount importance. Qatar, and I'm certain all other participants, are grateful to the court for the efficient conduct of these proceedings. Mr. President, members of the court, the rest of my intervention will be divided into two parts. First, I'll explain how Israel has created and perpetuated, in violation of its international obligations, a humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Second, I will set forth Qatar's positions on Israel's campaign to dismantle UNRWA in violation of its international obligations. But before turning to these issues, allow me to briefly address the scope of the questions put to the court. The General Assembly has not asked the court to merely list Israel's obligations in the abstract. Rather, it has asked the court to identify concretely Israel's specific obligations in relation to its conduct in the OBT. As Qatar explained in detail in its written statement, this is implicit in the preamble of the General Assembly's resolutions. For example, the court is being asked to assess, inter alia, whether Israel's legislations banning UNRWA is compatible with Israel's international obligations. Moreover, Qatar agrees with the state of Palestine that it would be artificial to separate the primary obligations from secondary obligations that arise directly out of Israel's violations. Israel's relevant obligation can thus be understood as encompassing also Israel's obligations arising from state responsibility, such as obligation of cessations and reparations. For example, as Qatar has explained, in the case of the illegal legislations banning UNRWA, Israel has an obligation of cessation and must repeal the legislations immediately. Mr. President, members of the court, I will now turn to my first topic and explain how Israel has created and perpetuated a humanitarian disaster in Gaza in violations of its international obligations. Since the outset of its onslaught on Gaza, Israel has consistently used the abbreviation of humanitarian aid and basic utilities as a method of war. Qatar will not address all Israel's crimes in Gaza. I will only focus on two categories relevant to the questions before the court. First, humanitarian aid, including food and water, and second, healthcare. As to the first category, at the beginning of the war, Israeli leaders announced a complete siege on Gaza, allowing no electricity, food, water, or fuel to enter. Since then, Israel has systematically prevented the delivery of life-saving aid by humanitarian organizations, in particular by UNRWA. Israel blocked humanitarian crossings in Rafah, Karam Abu Salim, and northern Gaza. In November 2024, UNRWA reported that Israel allowed entry of an average of only 30 trucks of humanitarian aid per day. This is only about 6% of the daily amount of aid that entered before the war. As a result of the mediation of Qatar alongside Egypt and the United States, Israel eased these restrictions when the latest ceasefire agreement came into force. The delivery of humanitarian aid scaled up during that brief period. However, this small progress was completely reversed on 2nd March 2025, the second day of the holy month of Ramadan, when Israel decided to cut off entry of all food, water, and other supplies in Gaza. As a group of UN independent experts explained, Israel is weaponizing humanitarian aid. You can find their press release at tab 3 of your folders. Indeed, Israel is using aid as a tool of extortion to further its military goals and as an act of collective punishment. In addition to blocking the distribution of aid, Israel has systematically targeted water infrastructure, food storage facilities, and aid convoys. Israeli military strikes have killed both national and international humanitarian personnel, as well as Palestinian civilians receiving aid. As a result, according to OCHA, hundreds of thousands of people are facing a catastrophic levels of food insecurity. Civilians, in particular children, have died of starvation and lack of potable water. Under our collective watch, Mr. President, it's an entire generation of Palestinians that Israel is destroying. Israel's conduct related to humanitarian aid has violated the numerous international obligations. But will only name a few relevant obligations that should not escape the court's attention. First, Qatar agrees with the State of Palestine, the United Nations, and other participants that as an illegal occupier, Israel has no standing to determine what states or international organizations are given access to Gaza. This is a prerogative of the Palestinian people in accordance with its right to self-determination. As the court has repeatedly held, Israel, as an occupying power, has the obligation not to impede the Palestinian people from exercising its right to self-determination. Second, as highlighted by almost all participants, international humanitarian law imposes both positive and negative obligations on Israel as an occupier. Not only must Israel refrain from blocking aid under Articles 30, 23, 52, and 60 one of the four Geneva Convention, but must also actively facilitate the entry and rapid distribution of humanitarian aid under Articles 23 and 61 and protect relief supplies against looting. Moreover, Israel has an obligation under international humanitarian law to both respect and actively protect humanitarian personnel and facilities. Third, Israel has an obligation not to use the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare by depriving them of objects indispensable to their survival. This includes willfully impeding relief supplies. Starvation is a war crime and the serious violations of international humanitarian law codified under Article 8 of the Rome Statute. Crucially, in November 2024, the pre-trial chamber of the International Criminal Court found that there were reasonable grounds to believe that the war crime of starvation has been committed. The pre-trial chamber's confidential decision is summarized in the press release included in tab 4 of your folders. Since March 2025, starvation is once again officially Israel's policy. It is thus urgently necessary for the court to recall Israel's obligations to put an end to this illegal policy. Fourth, in the South Africa versus Israel, the court has ordered Israel to take all necessary and effective measures to ensure, without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provisions at a scale of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. Qatar, along with at least 21 other participants, have pointed out to the applicability of the court's binding provisional measures orders issued in South Africa versus Israel case. Israel's failure to respect these orders is an added indication that it's in fact committing acts of genocide. Fifth, Qatar agrees with the 24 participants that have insisted on the application of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, to which Israel is a party. Under Article 6, Paragraph 2 of that convention, which reflects customary international law, state parties shall ensure to the maximum extent possible the survival and the development of the child. Israel is thus under unequivocal obligations to ensure the adequate nutrition of children and their survival. Respectfully, Qatar calls upon the court to emphasize the jus cogens character of this obligation. I now turn to healthcare. Mr. President, Israel has left Gaza's system medical care on the brink of the total collapse. Israel has blocked the entry into Gaza of healthcare workers, basic medicines, anesthesia, and life-saving equipment. At the same time, Israel has blocked and delayed safe evacuations by international organizations and 30 states of patients from Gaza, including children waiting cancer treatment. This atrocity has occurred in the context of Israel's widespread and systematic attacks against hospitals. In particular, UNRWA health centers have been targeted, with less than a third still functioning in Gaza, according to OCHA. Israel has also targeted hospitals established or supported by 30 states, including the only hospital specialized in cancer treatment. As a result, more than 1,400 medical professionals have been killed, and many have been arbitrarily arrested and tortured, according to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This includes 15 paramedics and 8 workers discovered in a mass grave on 30th March 2025. More information about this incident can be found at tab 5 of your folders. Mr. President, this conduct is a flagrant violation of Israel's obligations under international law. Under international humanitarian law, Israel has the duty to respect and protect medical facilities, staff, and transport, notably under Articles 18, 20, 21, and 22 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. This means that it must refrain from targeting them. Israel must also, under Article 56 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, ensure that hospital and medical services can properly work and that medical personnel of all categories are allowed to carry out their duties. Mr. President, members of the Court, I will now turn to my second and final topic, namely Israel's unlawful campaign against the United Nations, in particular UNRWA. Israel has long seen the UN as a thorn in the side of its colonial project in Gaza. The presence of the UN and the OBT promotes the self-determination and social cohesion of the Palestinian people by enabling them to enjoy certain very basic economic, social, and cultural rights. This is particularly true of UNRWA, which under normal conditions operate schools, health clinics, refugees camps, and provides food, shelter, and other social services to about 5.9 million Palestinian refugees in the OBT. It is thus not surprising that Israel has repeatedly attempted to thwart UNRWA's operations. Israel has a documented history of conducting intentional military strikes against UNRWA's property and staff during its previous attacks against Gaza Strip. As explained in detail by the State of Palestine on Monday, Israel has also called for the defunding of UNRWA on numerous occasions in multilateral fora, even before October 2023. Recently, Israel even used commercial billboards around the world and paid Google ads to spread misinformation about UNRWA, painting it as a terrorist organization and calling for its dismantlement. As the United Nations explained, concern about the UN must be brought to the attention of the organization so that the matter may be considered by the United Nations in accordance with its legal framework, including the privileges and immunities of the organizations and its personnel. Under this framework, the United Nations has the exclusive prerogative to decide when privileges and immunities is to apply. As the Court is aware, the independent review order by the UN Secretary General concluded that UNRWA has a more developed approach to neutrality than similar UN entities or NGOs. However, this did not deter Israel, which maintains its offensive against UNRWA. On the 28th of October 2024, Israel passed legislation which inter alia prohibits all contacts between Israeli authorities and UNRWA and prohibits UNRWA from operating any representation, providing any services, or carrying out any activities, directly or indirectly, within the sovereign territory of the State of Israel, which Israel legally considers as including East Jerusalem. You can find the text of this legislation at tab 6 of your folders. When the law came into effect at the end of January 2025, as you can see from Israel's letter at tab 7 of your folders, Israel required UNRWA to cease its operations and evacuate all its premises in East Jerusalem with less than 1 week's notice. This led to the evacuation of international staff from UNRWA's East Jerusalem offices to Jordan, while local staff were encouraged to stay home for their safety in light of arson attacks and violent protest. Israel has stated its intention to seize UNRWA's facilities in East Jerusalem and turn them into yet another illegal Israeli settlement. In parallel, Israeli forces have detained UNRWA staff members, including while on official duty, According to a March 2024 UNRWA report, UNRWA staff were held incommunicado and subjected to ill treatment and torture to obtain forced confessions. And in line with Israel's conduct during past hostilities in Gaza, since October 2024, Israeli forces have destroyed or damaged 2/3 of UNRWA's facilities and killed at least 290 UNRWA staff members, including in the line of duty. Israel's conduct toward UNRWA bluntly violates its international obligations. And while Qatar's statement focuses on UNRWA, the same applies to Israel's conduct toward other United Nations bodies and specialized agencies targeted by Israel, such as the World Food Programme and World Health Organization. As most participants have pointed out, Israel has no unilateral right to determine how the UN organizes itself in the OBT and has an obligation to allow it to continue to operate through UNRWA. This primarily stems from Article 2, Paragraph 5 of the UN Charter, which provides that as a UN member, Israel must give every assistance in any action the UN takes in accordance with the Charter. The General Assembly established UNRWA in accordance with the Charter. Thus, Israel has no obligations to second-guess that mandate or impose conditions on its exercise. Rather, it must cooperate with UNRWA and facilitate its operations. Moreover, as a UN agency, UNRWA, its property and personnel enjoy privileges and immunities, notably under Article 105 of the UN Charter, under the 1946 General Conventions on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations, and under customary international law. These privileges and immunities pledge Israel to allow UNRWA to fully function in Israel and in the OBT. These legal protections cannot be abrogated unilaterally by Israel. Therefore, even if UNRWA could be replaced, which it cannot, Israel has no right to demand that it be replaced. Israel's legislation substantially hinders UNRWA's operations throughout the OBT because it prohibits any contact between any Israeli authorities and UNRWA's or its representatives. This in turn could preclude Israeli authorities from providing UNRWA employees the permits that they require to even enter the OBT and from coordinating the passage of aid into the OBT. This reason alone is sufficient for the court to find that Israel is under an obligation to immediately revoke and cease to implement its 28 October 2024 legislations. As explained, the illegality of this legislation is at the heart of the General Assembly's request. Qatar thus respectfully asks the court to make an explicit finding in this regard. Mr. President, I will make 4 additional brief points regarding UN's privileges and immunities in the OBT. First, as the UN Legal Council stated under Section 3 of the General Convention, Israel has an absolute and mandatory obligation to respect the inviolability of United Nations premises, property, and assets at all times, including during armed conflict. They therefore cannot be expropriated, confiscated, bombed, or otherwise intervened with. Instead, the UN property and personnel must be protected at all times, including from private actors. Second, the UN and its officials enjoy a right of access to the OBT. As stated, Israel's occupation is illegal, and Israel has no standing to obstruct entry of the UN into the OBT. Moreover, both Article 105, Paragraph 2 of the UN Charter and the General Convention require Israel to ensure the freedom of movement of UN officials, including the Secretary General, and of experts on mission, such as Special Rapporteur. Third, Israel's detention of UN personnel for words spoken or acts done in the exercise of their function violates their immunity from legal process guaranteed under Section 18 of the General Convention. Israel's arbitrary detention of UNRWA personnel infringes at least on the United Nations' right to visit and communicate with detained staff members. Fourth, Qatar, like 19 other participants and the UN itself, emphasizes that the UN privileges and immunities cannot be overridden by military necessity or security or considerations of security. This is because they arise directly from the UN Charter and thus prevail over all international obligations in accordance with Article 103 of the Charter. This has been the United Nations' consistent position. Mr. President, in conclusion, Qatar is of the view that Israel has flagrantly violated its obligations under international law in relation to the presence and activities of the UN, other international organizations, and third states in and in relation to the OBT. This includes its obligation to respect international organizations' privileges and immunities, its obligations under the UN Charter to cooperate with the UN, its obligations under international humanitarian law, and its obligation to respect the Palestinians' rights to self-determination. As a result, Israel is under an obligation to seize these violations to provide full reparation for the damage caused by them and to provide guarantees and assurances of non-repetition. Finally, although the scope of this advisory opinion is limited to Israel's own obligations, Qatar would like to recall that all states have an obligation not to render aid to Israel and its violations of these obligations to the extent that they impede the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. Mr. President, honorable members of the court, this concludes my submissions on behalf of the state of Qatar. Qatar is grateful to all states and international organizations that have presented their views on the urgent questions posed by the General Assembly. Qatar remains deeply appreciative of the court's sustained attention to these critical matters and of its unwavering commitment to the maintenance of international peace and security and the enforcement of international law, particularly for those populations whose rights and protections are under the greatest threat. Let us be guided always by the enduring principle that salus populi suprema lex esto. The welfare of the people shall be the supreme law. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, honorable members of the court, for your kind attention.